than ever, I think we saw God. And this is dealing, I think, with the Middle Ages. The last time you dealt with the ancient church, gee whiz, what a time. This is Rome. They called it the Eternal City. They were not kidding. They were not kidding. The Eternal City. These people, in their self-understanding, saw the Roman Empire. They saw the Roman Empire as the oasis of meaning in the midst of the darkness of the barbarian world. This is what they hung on to. And particularly, I suppose, this became the more significant the more they realized it was passing away, until it was almost a frantic effort to hang on to the great structure known as Rome. Most of you know that Toynbee believes that Rome was never an upbeat time in the history of the West. That in the 5th century BC, with the decline of Greece, Plato and Aristotle came after the decline. At the decline of Greece, Rome was simply the tail end of the decline. And that age passed away with the passing of Rome. So this was not the period of great upbeat in terms of the broad picture of history as seen through Toynbee's eyes. But perhaps precisely because this was a time in which a certain culture was passing out of existence, that Rome was seen the more clearly in the imagination of the people as an eternal rock that they could hang on to, that they could hang on to. As a matter of fact, I suppose in our day that we are more able to understand the feeling that these people must have experienced than any other time since then, save at the collapse of the Middle Ages. There's a desperate hanging on in Western civilization in our time. There's a desperate hanging on in the United States of America. And good Lord, there's a horrible hanging on in the state of Texas, isn't there? Isn't there? Don't you sense that a part of our great spirit is just this? Rome was the great island. And old Augustine says to the soldiers, go to the front, to the Christian soldiers. Go to the front and stand there fighting until the last ditch. Preserve the order. But as you stand there preserving the order, let it be known that no order of this world is synonymous with what goes on in this world. And here was his great message in the city of God at the end of the time. What a message. Oh, you know, if we could just learn to meet people and the thought of people in the midst of their historical situation. Think of that book. It was a book. It was a book of hope, a book of faith, a book of meaning. That came out of the gizzard of the people of his time. Fight to preserve the order, but the orders come, the orders go. And here's the holy nonchalance that Luther spoke of, or the reliance upon God that came out of the Hebrew Christian community. Now, out of the collapse of Rome came this amazing time, the Middle Ages. We used to call it the Dark Ages. Dark. We forget we use value judgments, don't we? Huh? I imagine if you were standing here, or if you were standing over here, this wouldn't look so dark, would it? And today we're not so ready to call it the Dark Ages. Let's say this started around, say, the 6th century with Gregory I, and goes on over through the 15th century. The top of it was in the 11th and 12th century with Gregory VII and Boniface. Thomas came in the 13th. Already it was on the way down when Thomas came. And we want to try to locate him a little bit. This was a time in which the world was again centralized, and a brand new structure came. But if you're to understand Thomas, it seems to me that you have to understand what was going on down underneath while this was at its very height. Marx is one of the shrewdest analyzers of history, and his analysis fits in somewhat right here. Even back in the 8th and the 9th centuries, famines and pestilence began to break out in Europe, and this made for a mobile population. Nothing like famine and pestilence and tribulation to get peoples on the move, and they began to move throughout Europe. Just move. And this was causing problems in terms of the overall view of centralizing and stabilizing the culture. Now, when you have internal perplexities in a nation or in a culture, what's one of the best ways to handle it? If you were a statesman now, a Machiavellian statesman, maybe that's the only kind that we ought to have, as a matter of fact. What's one of the best ways to handle this? War! And this is what happened. What do we call these wars? The Crusades. And so then we drum up the Crusades. And this took care of the movement, didn't it, huh? This took care of it. But then, history has a great irony, doesn't it, huh? What happened when these people got outside of their own country and their own lands? Well, they made a discovery, and many of them, and the fundamental discovery they made was trade, of course. And they brought this insight back into Europe and oozed it into the structures here in the form, first of all, of the burghers. And the moment that the seed of the burghers was sown, then this two-story universe of the clergy and the princes and the serfs was split. The great middle class. What's the name that we've come to use for the middle class? The bourgeoisie. The burghers. Well, here we are, the burghers. Every one of us in this room is the bourgeoisie. Every one of us. And here we got our start, back here in Europe. And this was the knife that split into this two-story structure, radical two-story structure, the burghers. And with the rise of this class, I think the Middle Ages came to an end. But the seeds of this were way back here. Marx suggested that every age creates its own Frankensteinian monster, that every age digs its own grave, which it finally falls in and is buried. And I suggest to you that this is the grave that was dug here. As a matter of fact, this worked backwards here. The more they had the wars to handle the problem of the movement of people, the more money they needed. And as the wars created the burghers who had the money, the upper classes got their money to carry on the wars, which gave these people tremendous prestige and increased their wealth. For the price of borrowing money was tremendous. And here's where your great city and this class got its power. Now, in the midst of this came Thomas Aquinas. In the midst of this. Now, he was not aware of all of this, as you and I would point it out, but brother, he was aware of something. And I think to finish this picture, I've got to draw you some map, something like this. Now, the first one who recognizes this, there's a prize for him. Huh? Who's giggling? Huh? Huh? Well, what? Guernica. Hey, thank you. When I was in New York, I saw it burn. It's as big as all of that over there. At the first time I'd seen it. Oh my, it's tremendous. Well, yeah, this is not that. What is this? Huh? Well, thank you. You see, there's some people that appreciate art here. Now, to understand Thomas, it seems to me that you have to start back here of Athens. And the time of the great academies. Very shortly after Aristotle faded away in this world. He was lost. He was lost. Except the Jews who were dispersed brought Aristotle down here to Palestine. The rest of the world, probably due to the influence of the impact of the mystery and the mystical religions of the East, this world, took Plato and began to formulate its self-understanding out of Plato, and Aristotle was lost. Except these Jews have played a strange role in history, haven't they? Just a very odd role. They got a hold of him and preserved him and kept him and studied him and kept his documents and his writing. And then when the Muslim faith arose, about 500 BC, and they came with their yellow badges to pin on the Jews. It's funny, the Muslims created that, and the Christians took it over from them in the Middle Ages when we set up the ghetto, and Hitler got that from all of us. When the Muslims forced the Jews after the fall of Jerusalem over into Babylon, they took Aristotle over here, which was at the heart of the Muslim empire, and the Muslims picked up Aristotle. Then when they began this tremendous pincher movement, you remember, on Europe, I tell you, history is a fate-filled thing, isn't it, huh? When they began this pincer movement, which has been tried since, hasn't it? On Europe, they took Aristotle with him. They got blocked here, but in Albania over here and in Yugoslavia, you have Muslims today, for it stopped here. And then it came up through Spain, and at the Battle of Tours, just by luck, I think, by sheer luck, Martin defeated the Muslims and stopped the closing of this pincer movement. If this hadn't happened, you and I wouldn't be sitting here tonight. You can just bet your boots on it. This reminds me of a story. Who wrote The Man Without a Country? Hale? Huh? Hale? Anyway, he wrote a sort of a science fiction story. Some people say he's the father of science fiction. And this was he took the story of Joeseph in the Old Testament and told the story of how he was sold into the hands of the slave traders, and the first night out he was in camp, and there was a guard put over Joeseph, and Joeseph awakened and found the guard asleep. And he said, well, here's where I'll escape and get back to Papa. And so he tiptoes out of the tent and was just about out of the camp when some damn little dog barked. Woof, woof, woof! Woke up the guards. They came and snatched him and took him. He went down into Egypt, etc., etc., and then history went on. And at this point, he stops the story, and just at the time that little face is about to bark, the author, Hale, gets into the story and grabs his mouth and holds it shut. And old Joeseph gets home. And this meant that old Egypt down here, that old Egypt in the time of the famine, which had food, became tremendously powerful. These people up here died out, and carries it on through of how then Carthage became the great and defeated Rome. They came close to it anyway, as a matter of fact, didn't they? Defeated Rome, and so on, and all the histories that change. It's like that story in the time machine, you know, of where you go back in time, and if you tramp on even a little insect, by the time you get 1,000,000 years down the line, why, that's changed the whole face of the earth. Very interesting. Well, this is one of the places in which I am persuaded that you and I are finally forced up, feel that say to me, they have never been forced to the edge of their existence at this time. What is life all about? Or should we not look at history? Isn't it funny how we study history and we don't hear it at all? We listen to lectures on history and we don't hear a single word that's being said. Not a single word that's being said. Anyway, came Mr. Aristotle, and he got stopped here. And then came those great universities in Spain, which were Aristotelian in their fundamental orientation. And the Pyrenees blocked it off. In the meantime, Brother Plato, in and through Augustine, had filled it into this whole area, so the church was fundamentally Platonic. But you can't keep Aristotle down, for across the Pyrenees, see the influence of these great universities here. And the church always displays its humanity. It's never been able to keep these petticoats from showing. For she was scared to death when Aristotle began to filter through the Pyrenees. I got to stop here. This is just too good. I pointed out to you before that in the early church they used Platonic forms, in the medieval church Aristotelian forms to articulate the gospel. Luther used nominalism, Calvin used Stoicism. In the last century we used Hegelian and Kantianism, and in this century we're using, because it's going like this so fast, we're using naturalism, Freudianism, Marxism, existentialism, etc., etc., etc. to articulate the gospel. Now, in every age, the church gets her britches scared off of her, because whenever there's any kind of a shift in the climate of thought of the culture of which she's a part, she uses Platonism to articulate the gospel. Then, reaching for security, she makes this the gospel in itself. So when somebody else comes along in culture with some other climate of thought, she gets scared. Now, the church here, for, good Lord, almost 200 years, he banned Aristotelianism and made it a death penalty in the church for anyone who would articulate the gospel in the categories of naturalism or Marxism. Isn't this amazing? We haven't got over it, have we? About the time your Sunday school teachers got the gospel all wrapped up in Hegelian and Kantian terms, never having heard of Hegel or Kant, but that didn't make any difference. It was there. It was there. Then they got scared to death when Hegel and Kant in culture was no longer able to freight the meaning of culture, and the gospel has to be stated in some other way. And over again this has happened. Therefore, when Thomas Aquinas came along, he was a giant who had courage to stand out against the church in his day and to take the categories of thought that the people were using and articulate the gospel. And can't you understand people in this church saying, tish, 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 this is modernism, tish, 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 this isn't what our Sunday school teacher taught us. And then Luther, the same thing, huh? Well, now I don't want to go into the difference between Aristotelianism and Platonism, but simply to point out that in the imagination of the people in those days, that Aristotle's philosophy in relationship to Plato's philosophy was intensely practical. It was down to earth. If you like, Aristotle was suggesting that you begin with your sense experience with this entity and this entity and this entity and that one, and then you abstract from that the idea of chairness. Whereas in their imagination, Plato began with the idea of chairness and then moved down here to this and this and this, which was participating in chairness. Now, if you even take this, you can see how in people's mind this was the practical. Now, with the rise of the bourgeoisie in Europe, can you not see how Aristotelianism became that kind of self-understanding, philosophical understanding that these people grabbed hold of? They grabbed hold of. Aristotelianism became the very heartthrob of your bourgeois movement and remained that way up and through John Dewey, if you like. Up and through John Dewey. It became the fundamental philosophy, it seems to me, that informed it. Anyway, in Thomas's time, with this movement which brought Aristotelianism here, along with the rise of the bourgeois class, came a brand new world that Thomas had to speak to. And he spoke to it, and he made use of Aristotelianism to do it. This, it seems to me, is something of the cultural situation which made Thomas Aquinas possible, who then influenced the historical situation in a way that few men in history have had influence upon history. He was a giant of a man with a tremendous intellect. And some people have said he had the greatest mind, at least synthesizing mind, that the West has ever seen. Now let's look at this fellow. I've had a hard time calling him my brother in the faith, though in faith he has always been my brother and my father. Maybe it's because there's too much of Thomas in me that I cannot face him. I do not know. At times I become aware of that, even though I have fought him in all of my adult life. And yet in recent years I have begun to see how this man is my father. At the same time, I must say no to him. And very frequently I have got caught in my own trap. It's as if I was living in Thomas's world and trying to say no to Thomas while I stayed in his same world, where the world I actually was living in the 20th century was not this world that Thomas lived in at all. There it seems to me very frequently that I've gotten confused. But let's look at this understanding of the Christian faith that Thomas spelled out in this social context. Perhaps we better begin just with the whole idea of God in Thomas. Thomas began with a presupposition that he could not face, I feel, and I do not think anyone who begins with this presupposition can face the presupposition. He was a rationalist. Now, in essence, what this means, that these people understand that fundamentally this universe is a rational universe. Therefore, when man uses his rational capacity, his mind, and is very careful that his emotions do not get mixed up in it, and is very careful that he begins with the first principles of reason, that is, with natural law, then whatever he thinks about the universe is the way the universe is, because the universe is rational. Do you see that? Do you see that? Now, with this presupposition, you're not about to see that you presuppose this, I suppose. Anyway, Thomas begins with man as a rational animal, that this universe is fundamentally rational, and then he spells out his system. This rational man begins by proving the existence of God. Wait, that term isn't up. That's not right, is it? He begins by proving the existence of first cause. This is much better, isn't it? And he uses the classical rational arguments for the existence of God, minus 1 and 2 simply by implication. He uses the cosmological argument, that's probably the basic one, and somewhat the teleological argument. He rejects the ontological argument, although some people believe that it was unconsciously in them. And then later came the moral argument and the historical argument for the existence of God. But most people believe that these were implicit in him anyway. But we need to look at these very, very briefly. You've heard them all your life. Your Sunday school teacher was skilled in them, and you've picked it up in, well, every bull session that you ever had on the subject of religion, as you grew up, was based upon this. And from where I stand at the moment, this means that most of our life in talking about religion, we were just beating our gum, living in a world that we do not even live in at all. But let's look at these for the sake of our fathers moldering in their grave. The cosmological argument. It begins with taking sensation seriously, and then it moves to certain laws of the mind. The sensations, our senses, presents us sensa, or mediates to us the external objects in the world. We begin there. And then in the mind there are two laws, the laws of cause and effect. This comes from Aristotle, that every effect has a cause, which is an effect of a cause, and so on. And the other is the law of logical consistency, or of rational consistency. It works this way. When this is mediated to me, the law of cause and effect suggests that this had to have a cause, but this was an effect which had a cause, which had a cause, which had a cause, which had a cause, which had a cause. And the very way that man's mind is formulated, our rational capacities, means that this is thrown into an infinite regress. There's no end to it. But an infinite regress is logically not consistent, and therefore an end of it has to be called. For instance, perhaps you put it this way. If you have a 10-gallon can and you suggest that you're going to put an infinite number of gallons in this can, this becomes ridiculous and we chuckle. Or to make it more concrete, if you suggest you're going to put 1,000 gallons in this, why, you laugh. This becomes which is a first cause, or a cause that does not have to account for self. Therefore, there is a first cause in this universe, and if this is not true, the world is not rational. Therefore, there's a first cause, or God. This is the famous cosmological argument, the chicken and the egg. The other one is the teleological argument, which was developed later on with the big clock and the little clock. You and I look out in the world and we see certain patterns. We see design. We see purpose. We look at the stars and see order there. We look down through the microscope and see order. And if we begin with the fact that this is a rational universe, or to put it another way, if we begin with glasses of order on, well, all we see is order. We ignore the disorder, but we see the order that is there. If you begin with these presuppositions here. Now, then with the idea, which is Aristotelian also, that something lower cannot determine a higher, and a purpose is higher than no purpose, therefore there had to be a fundamental purpose in the universe to account for this. Or it's the old story that you and I have heard many times. If you go into a room and you find a lot of blocks, ABC blocks thrown around, and then you go out and you come back in and they've been arranged so that they spell hippopotamus, and there's nobody in that room, we just automatically, but the dog, we just automatically believe that some human being, some intelligent person has been in this room. And this is what this argument, the teleological argument, fundamentally is. The ontological argument is this famous one that goes something like this. Man has the conception of perfection in his mind. Now, perfection is that than which nothing higher exists. Perfection is that concept, than which nothing higher, nothing more complete, exists. And then you ask the question, is existence better than non-existence? And you say, yes, existence is better than non-existence. Well, all right. If existence is better than non-existence, then existence is a part of perfection, or there would be something higher than this concept. Therefore, perfection, the perfect being, exists. This is your ontological argument, which Thomas threw out, but one which has been used over and over again. And you can see the rational presuppositions there. The moral argument was articulated perhaps most clearly, although this is back in Aristotle too, I think, most clearly in terms of Kant, and I mentioned that to you one day. Kant begins with the fact that there's a rational universe. Then man is the kind of a being who is caught between duty and desire, duty and happiness. And to do your duty, you've got to lose out on happiness. And yet, if this is a rational world, why, you can't lose out on a part of life. Therefore, there's got to be a life after death that balances the scales between happiness and duty. And if there's a life which balances these scales, there has to be that which balances these scales. And here is God. And here is God. The great historical argument is like this. This was really dramatized in the classical anthropological studies of the last century, in which you look all over the world and you find that every tribe and nation and tongue are religious. Aristotle's one of his fundamental axioms of rationality was whatever is universal is natural, and whatever is natural is eternal. For it. And here then you get to the idea of the existence of God through the fact that everybody in the world worships God. Now, you and I can go through and pull tear these to pieces, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm not even interested in it. You've got to assume, if you're going to try to tear these to pieces, you have to assume their beginning point in order to do it. Well, I make no bones of it. For me, this beginning point is nonsense. Therefore, to even fool around with these, for me, is ridiculous. I do not mean it is for you, but for me it is. Now, in terms of these rational arguments for the existence of God, then you get God. You get God. Now, you got to see what you got as God, though. What you got is, here's a rational universe with a bunghole in it, and God becomes a rational concept which performs the role of being the bung in your metaphysical world. In other words, in this approach, this is a concept in our mind. Now, and a good many of us, when we use the symbol God, are pointing to some concept within the mind of man, which only is based upon the beginning point of man accepting himself as a rational animal, a first cause. You can see that this is Aristotelian Greek and is not Hebraic. Whatever else God is, for the Hebrew, he's in no wise a concept in the mind of man. He's an over-againstness. He's a not-me-ness. He's a bump-into-ness. Not a concept at all. Now, I won't go into this because I've got so much more to do, except to point that this is perfection. And perfection means then unlimited in any sense. And if anything is unlimited, then of course it is infinite. And if it is infinite, then one of its qualities is goodness. You've got to remember this. And by reason, Thomas gets to this, and this is where most people believe that he used the ontological argument, even though he rejected it intentionally. For this is his reasoning. Now then you've got to come this way, if you're to understand Thomas. After you get up into the air with your reason, you've got to come this way. By man using his reason, he bumps into historical material called the Bible. Called the Bible. This is historical material. Now this Bible talks about certain miracles that were performed, and about a miracle about some guy getting resuscitated as a cadaver. Now, using Aristotle here again, and I think one time I went into this with you, so I'll be very hurried. Using Aristotle again, which said that every effect, every cause must have an effect adequate unto the cause. Therefore, if you have an unnatural or a supernatural effect, you had to have a supernatural cause in order to explain it. Do you follow that? So that these miracles point to the fact that some fella named of Jesus was an effect that had to have a supernatural cause. A miracle here was defined in terms of a two-story universe. Now, once you have this fella then, a supernatural being, by the appeal to miracles, and the Catholic Church developed certain kinds of them here, Jesus' own miracle, and the miracle that Jesus was, and the miracle of the Church. This is the one they pressed hard at times, such as, why, if you didn't have some supernatural miracle back here, you couldn't account for the tremendous growth and the quick expansion of the Church. That was before communism hit. Yeah, nobody's seen nothing like the spread of communism in history. I suppose that we'll drop this one and hang on to the cadaver or something back here. Now, by the use of Aristotle, then, this proves something. Now, once you prove that this fellow was supernatural, then what he had to say was supernatural. Do you see that? So that when he said the sky is pink, cheese is blue, God is three, because he didn't say that, then this became truth. And so here you had a series of propositional truth based upon the supernatural qualities of this man, based upon the miracles understood in terms of an Aristotelian metaphysics. And now the irony of this was that fundamentally what this fella said was that the church is to have authority for truth and power on earth. Therefore, you get to a supernatural church based upon a supernatural dictum from a supernatural being who be based upon a supernatural act, based upon Aristotelian philosophy. Now, where you tie in your reasoning here and your reasoning here is that this first cause up here is good. Therefore, it would not surprise you if there should occur on earth the kind of a man who could give an institution the kind of a power which could give to man the meaning of his existence, the supernatural end of man, the supernatural end. Now, there's only one problem that comes up, and that is, how can you trust this book? Well, then the answer is, it's a supernatural book. But wait, the reasoning had to go from the book through Aristotelian metaphysics to the miracles, and this, do you see the circle? Therefore, this is understood. This is always suasive argumentation or moral argumentation, or as they put it, there is so much evidence here, although it is not as ironclad as this is ironclad, that any right-thinking man would be swayed by it. Do you see this? And this is where the gap in that irrationality. Your biblical fundamentalists who have taken over Roman Catholicism, lock, stock, and barrel here. Do you see it? Lock, stock, and barrel. They are not even clear of this circle, which your Romans have been. So that you do not even have moral argumentation here. It's clear on rational argument at this point. This is why, gee whiz, if you're going to ape the Catholics, you better become a Catholic. These guys are hard-headed thinkers. They're hard-headed. You'll not find neat little holes like that in which you could throw them out the window on. Now we come to the church as a supernatural institution which has the supernatural or the final end of man to offer to man. To offer to man. Now, for the everyday person, there's another existential beginning point, not this. And this is in the church itself. And here's where I have great tenderness. I have great tenderness for, well, when I used to live in New York City, I used to sometimes early in the morning go to St. Patrick's Cathedral. And there I would find the scrub women coming from the skyscrapers. Oh, Lord, help us. You know, there's so much suffering going on in the world that we aren't aware of. Anyway, I used to see these scrub women. Gnarled hands, sort of broken women, many of them, who had been scrubbing all night long in the skyscrapers while the rest of us slept, slip in the morning to offer their prayers. To offer their prayers. And what they had come to trust in life is this great institution. This great institution. Now, I think one must not become sentimental here, although I have a tremendous temptation to become sentimental here. But one has to see that there was a certain kind of honesty in all of this, that they put their trust in this institution, which of course then set up, because there were two radical different beginning points, the double standard, the clergy and the laity. But now let's come to man's final end. If you don't understand this, you will not understand the final end. Though I've made this somewhat popular, it seems to me this is what Thomas, where you have to begin if you're going to understand Thomas. The beatific vision. You've heard of this, have you? Huh? The experience of beatitude, the beatific vision. Well, it's great. It's great. They begin with the two-story universe of Aristotle. You have a supernatural world, and then you have a natural world. This, I suggest to you, you do not have in the Bible. You have a one world there. But in Aristotle's metaphysics, you have two. I was riding along in the train out of Washington, and some young girl came back in the diner and sat down across from me, and we got to chatting. She asked me if I knew some character down here in Texas. His name was Roger Turner. Gene, that's not it. Well, I got it written down from Fishermuir. Well, went to a little Christian Science college out in. Well, what's her name? What's her first name? Anyway, we had a nice chat, Roger. They began with the first story and the second story universe. And finally, in the second story, the supernatural, as far as man came, entered into the realm of life and the realm beyond life, of death. The beatific vision is only to be realized beyond death. And to put it very briefly, the beatific vision is the experience beyond death of perfect knowledge of God. Perfect knowledge of God. And that's one part of it. And this is the central part of it. And then perfect happiness in knowing perfectly God. And then perfect love. How many Romans are there here in the house in terms of looking forward to the beatific vision? Yeah. Why didn't your Sunday school teacher at time bounce you on her knee and tell you of the time when you'd know God face to face? And this would perfect your being and would give you final happiness and joy, huh? Now, she didn't call it the beatific vision, but we Methodists, at least, we're far more Roman. As a matter of fact, John Wesley was tremendously, I think, influenced head-on by the Roman. Then we like to. But now we've got to come down out of heaven for just a moment in order to see how we get there. You begin with the natural world, and let's begin with knowledge. You have very practical knowledge. That's on the lowest scale, and then you have scientific knowledge. That's on the next scale, and then you have philosophical knowledge, and this is the highest kind of natural knowledge that man possesses. And this is Aristotle. I think you see. This is natural knowledge. Now, added to this is the supernatural the supernatural knowledge or the knowledge of faith. And this a man has in this life. Now we went over a moment ago the highest kind of natural knowledge that we can have, which is a knowledge that God is and something about what God is. Now anything on top of that is the knowledge of faith. And the knowledge of faith for Thomas is a propositional truth, that man's reason cannot arrive at by himself. And I'll come back to this in just a moment, if you'll hold this. Now, following Aristotle also, Thomas was suggesting that there are certain virtues that man can cultivate, and they are the cardinal virtues of temperance and courage and wisdom and justice. And then there are supernatural virtues that man can have in this life, and these are the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Now, following of man, and his mind directs it to the highest possible object. And then Aristotle said that pleasure is like the dewdrop on the rose that gives it the last bit of glistening. He wasn't a head-on hedonist as some of us try to make him into, but there was joy when you had made use of your rational capacities, which enabled your practical capacities that bring forth virtue to properly function. Then the dewdrop on top of it, was the joy that this gave to you, or the pleasure. So that man has a certain natural joy, and then added to that is the dewdrop that comes when a man's mind is supernaturally oriented, which brings to temporal fruition his own practical powers. Then this dewdrop of supernatural joy is present. You've heard people make this kind of a distinction. Say, oh, you people of the world, you got your pleasures. Wine, women, and song, and even better ones than that you have. But then there's a spiritual joy that you don't know anything about. Here's the Catholicism slipping in when it's put in this form. Now, I think maybe to understand this, you've got to see Thomas's understanding of original sin. It went something like this. Man from the very beginning was a two-storied being, a natural and a supernatural being, if you like, although that doesn't put it quite right. I'll show you in a moment. Anyway, before the fall of man, man had all of the natural knowledge. His rational capacities were functioning properly, and he had all of the practical virtues, and accompanying that was the natural joy and the natural pleasure. But man was a supernatural being, not in his own right, but because God had given him certain gifts. This belonged to his essence, so to speak. This was added to it, and the gifts were this level. Now, when man fell, there's one thing man lost completely, brother. It was these gifts. God took them away from him. And then he disordered his natural capacities, so that actual man, as you find him, he didn't have this joy because he does not have these virtues, because his rational capacities are not functioning properly. And this is the original sin in Thomas. Now, what role does this church have for man? Well, I mentioned to you before that the church served two great purposes. One is that it gave man the knowledge of the supernatural world, and secondly, it gave him the power to attain to this knowledge, and therefore this virtue, and therefore this happiness. And if he continued in the same, lo, he should one day realize the beatific vision, in which he should know God perfectly as any creature could know him, in which he should love God perfectly, and in which he should have perfect joy and perfect happiness. Perfect joy, because I don't want to use the word happiness, because the beatific vision, using Aristotle once again here, as a whole, is happiness. The man who knows, and the man who morally realizes, and the man who possesses joy, all of this is the happy man in the Aristotelian sense of it. Now, what is the knowledge? Well, I traced it here that the church was the supernatural human community which had this knowledge of the beatific vision, or the possibility of man, or the good of man, which man could not have by himself. It possessed the knowledge of faith. Now, here is where you get into propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge. The church is a supernatural institution who has the insight into the final end, or the supernatural end of man, and can give these truths in the form of propositions. So that here it is the revealer. It is the revealer. But it is also the empower. The sacraments in the church are the power that the church presents to give to the people of this world, which will enable them to possess this knowledge, which is to possess this virtue, which is to possess this joy. Now, I can't go into much into his psychology, but you've got to have a little bit into his psychology, Thomas's psychology, in order to grasp this. Here is man's mind, and here are his desires, and here are his habits in between. In between. Or let's put it his will, although this is a little difficult here in Thomas. Now, a man's mind can know, and the purpose of this knowledge is to control the desires so that they will move in the direction that man's mind indicates. And when the desires move after the dictates of the mind of man, this for Thomas is the will. This is always a rational will for Thomas. And habits or virtue are always in service of the rational will. For instance, if I have the habit of temperament, yes, I have that, of temperance, this means that a certain strength, that's what virtue means here, that's really what is behind habit. I have a certain power, character power within myself that draws certain of my desires into the control, the direct control of my rational nature. Therefore, I have a propensity to be a temperate person. I have a propensity. This is under the control. This came directly from Aristotle. This is Aristotelian psychology. Now, there's another part of the affective, or the conative part of man, which is directly related to the mind, and it goes like this. When a certain natural truth is presented to man's mind itself can give direct assent to that truth. In other words, the will is such that it is always seeking the genuine natural end that the will, that the mind holds up before the human soul to control the desires. But when you have a supernatural truth presented to man's mind, the will cannot directly assent to this. This is beyond. That is, the man's will can assent that God is. But if I say to you God is 3 in 1, that's a supernatural truth, and my mind can't accept that. It becomes nonsense, so to speak. Now, what grace through the sacraments does is to operate in the will, giving it a supernatural shot so that it can force the mind to assent to that which on its own basis it cannot assent to. Do you see that? Golly, you Methodists ought to see that. Grace is some kind of a supernatural power that it's like that supercharges my will to believe things, I'm going to caricature, that I know damn well aren't true. Do you see that? But now to take it out of the caricature. Grace is a supernatural power that gives my will the power to assent to a truth that my mind cannot assent to naturally. Naturally. This is fundamentally what grace is. Which then he gives to man the fundamental virtues, theological virtues, which then gives him the supernatural joy. And a good bit of us have been reared on this. Have been reared on it. Now, one thing more, and that is that there are previews of the vision to come. There are previews. In other words, there's a kind of knowledge that's even above this theological knowledge. It's a mystical knowledge, or Thomas called the experience the rapture. The rapture, in which at certain occasions in life, rarely, on rare occasions, and on a very temporary way, and in an insufficient fashion, man had a direct vision of the beatific vision, though he did not fully participate in it. Call this the rapture. This is not the kind of rapture that you have in the millenarian groups. You know the rapture here is, you grew up in some of this, didn't you? The rapture here is at the end of the world, when the saints disappear from the earth, leaving the sinners here for a space of 1,000 years before the final judgment. I remember one time I was in California bumming around the country years ago. This is a young fella, younger than you guys are. And I got hungry, and therefore was living in the house of anybody who would take me in California, and some Pentecostal fella took me in and fed me. And I remember I was sitting at his table there, and he was sitting here, and he says to me, you think the rapture will come tonight? Well, I had not quite heard of the rapture. And so I say to him, I'm not sure what it is. And he said, well, if the rapture would come right now, all you would see would be my clothes with my spectacles on top of them there at the floor. It took me several years to figure out that that was an insult, that I would be left around to observe. Thomas's idea of the rapture was something different. And it was the mystical experience that was given to some people where they had sort of a direct preview of the beatific vision. But for Thomas, it was rare, it was temporary, and it was finally lacking in adequacy.